This is part 2 of the lecture notes for Chapter 7 on cellular respiration. And we left off with the very first metabolic pathway in cellular respiration called glycolysis. Glycolysis, the name glycolysis explains what happens during glycolysis. Glyco refers to glucose. It actually refers to carbohydrate, but glyco refers to glucose and lysis means breakdown. So glycolysis is the step where glucose is broken down. And you can see here that glucose is a 6-carbon hexagon-shaped molecule. So it contains 6 carbons, 6 carbon atoms. And several chemical reactions occur that, again, I'm not going to waste time going through them. If we were in a different course, a higher level biology course, we might go through these different chemical reactions. But just understand that 10 different chemical reactions occur. And during those chemical reactions, the end result is 2 ATP molecules are produced and 2 NADH molecules are produced and 2 pyruvate molecules are produced. So glucose is broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules, and I will show you that's the very last chemical that's produced. We know that glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and you can see here that pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. So there are 2 pyruvates that are produced, each having 3 carbons, each of those molecules containing 3 carbons. So glucose is broken down. During the process, 2 ATP molecules are produced and 2 NADH. And remember, the NADH molecules as well as FADH2 molecules are going to be very important in the very last metabolic pathway called oxidative phosphorylation. And they're going to play a role as electron carriers because remember that hydrogen atom contains an electron. So they're going to play a role as electron carriers later on in cellular respiration. I also want to point out that the 2 ATP molecules that are produced by substrate level phosphorylation. And I can show you both examples of where this happens. Okay, so if you look at step 7, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, needs a phosphate to become ATP. So it obtains that phosphate by removing it. This is where that phosphate comes from that is added to ADP to produce ATP. So the substrate is 1,3-biphosphoglycerate. That's the substrate in substrate level. And that substrate provides a phosphate group to ADP, and that forms ATP. And the same thing happens over here in step 10. You have an ADP molecule that removes a phosphate from this substrate called PEP, phosphoenol pyruvate. So PEP is the substrate that provides a phosphate to ADP, producing ATP. So substrate level phosphorylation simply means that we remove a phosphate from some chemical or substrate and add it to ADP, producing ATP. The problem is you can't make too many ATPs that way. So glycolysis produces 2 of the ATP molecules in cellular respiration, but 2 ATP molecules are not nearly as much as our cells need. Now, this slide, let me see which slide it is. This is slide number 12, and so you can go back to the slide, chapter 7 slides, and you can watch this video on your own, and it will show you the process of glycolysis in more detail. Now, our second metabolic pathway in cellular respiration is called the oxidation of pyruvate. And you need to remember that during this step, it begins with pyruvate because pyruvate was the product of glycolysis. So the two pyruvate molecules from glycolysis are going to enter the mitochondria in eukaryotic cells. Now, and we're just going to assume that the cells are eukaryotic because it would be different in prokaryotic cells since they don't have a mitochondria. But the two pyruvate molecules enter the mitochondria. So glycolysis occurred in the cytoplasm, and the rest of the metabolic pathways will occur in the mitochondria. And this is a very short but important chemical reaction. It's just a single chemical reaction. The two pyruvate molecules are converted into two acetyl-CoA molecules. CoA stands for coenzyme A. And then the acetyl-CoA is going to enter the citric acid cycle. So two pyruvate molecules are the inputs of this particular step, and then the outputs are carbon dioxide, 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, 2 molecules of NADH, and then 2 molecules of acetyl coenzyme A. I'm going to write the 2 here. I don't like how it's not written on the same line. So 2 carbon dioxide, 2 NADH, and 2 acetyl coenzyme A. Now the carbon dioxide we breathe out because it's toxic to our cells. The NADH, remember, is going to go on to the fourth step, the fourth metabolic pathway, and be a source of electrons. It will be an electron carrier to help produce more ATP. And then the acetyl coenzyme A is going to enter the citric acid cycle. Now, one last thing I want to mention is that the pyruvate molecules contain 3 carbons each. Pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule. Acetyl-CoA has lost one of those carbons. It's a 2-carbon molecule, and it loses that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a 1-carbon molecule. So pyruvate loses a carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, and it becomes acetyl coenzyme A. And that is, acetyl coenzyme A is generated in order to kind of kickstart the citric acid cycle. Now, the citric acid cycle is another series of steps, which again, you do not have to memorize, not in this course anyway. But I would like for you to know the first step. I would like for you to know the step that gets the citric acid cycle started. And I would like for you to understand the main purpose of the citric acid cycle, which is to generate many more electron carriers in the form of NADH and FADH2. So the first step in the citric acid cycle is the acetyl coenzyme A, which is a 2-carbon molecule, is combined with oxaloacetate, which is a 4-carbon molecule. So what you get is citrate or citric acid. Citric acid and citrate are the very same thing. It's just 2 different ways of saying the same thing. What you get is citrate, which is a 6-carbon molecule. And that begins the citric acid cycle. And the citric acid cycle just gradually breaks down the citric acid into molecules with less and less carbon until you end up with oxaloacetate, which has 4 carbons. And what's happening is as each carbon is removed from the citric acid and then from the other chemicals in the chain, a carbon dioxide is given off. So since this cycle occurs twice, it occurs twice because there are two acetyl coenzyme A's that enter the cycle. Two acetyl-CoAs that enter the cycle. So since this citric acid cycle occurs twice, instead of 3 NADHs and 1 FADH2 and 2 CO2s and 1 ATP, you can multiply all of that by 2. And so your final product, the final products of the citric acid cycle are going to be 2 total ATP molecules that are produced the same way they were in glycolysis by substrate level phosphorylation, and then 6 NADH molecules, which are going to be important in the fourth metabolic pathway of cellular respiration, 2 FADH2 molecules, and 4 carbon dioxide molecules are given off. Now, up to this point, our glucose molecule that originally was broken down in glycolysis has given us these outputs. So just all the way up to this point until we go into the fourth step, oxidation, the oxidative phosphorylation, we've got four ATP molecules. 2 came from glycolysis, 2 came from the citric acid cycle. We've produced 6 carbon dioxide molecules, which is the total number of carbon dioxide produced in cellular respiration. We have produced a total of 10 NADH molecules, which are going to be important in the last step, and 2 FADH2 molecules, which, just like the NADH, these are electron carriers because they carry electrons in their hydrogen atoms. The question at the bottom says, is most of the energy from glucose stored in the ATP, the carbon dioxide, or the electron carrier molecules? And the answer is most of the energy from glucose is stored in the electron carrier molecules because they're going to go on and produce, if you notice at this point in time, we've only produced 4 ATP molecules out of 36. We've still got 32 ATP left, and they're going to be produced in the last step by the electron carrier molecules, the NADH and the FADH2. So, moving on to the last step, oxidative phosphorylation. Most of the ATP produced during cellular respiration occurs during this step. And this is the only pathway where oxygen is used, where oxygen is an input. And this pathway consists of an electron transport chain and a process called chemiosmosis. And this process generates the rest of the ATP from cellular respiration. And so it does occur in the mitochondria, just like the last 2 steps. And I'm going to begin explaining it to you, but you can see that here is a link to a YouTube video clip that will show you the process. But you do have to understand what you're looking at here in the picture. You know that this is a phospholipid bilayer, but it's not the plasma membrane. It's the phospholipid bilayer that is the inner mitochondrial membrane in the mitochondria. So if we go back to the other page, it's the mitochondria has an outer membrane, and then it has an inner membrane that's folded, and that's outlined in green. So that's what we're looking at here is the inner mitochondrial membrane, the folded membrane. And this is where the electron transport chain is located, and it's where the last step is going to occur. So you can see what happens is that NADH and FADH2 are going to provide electrons to the electron transport chain.